Hello and welcome to the newsletter for September 13th. So let's carry on with our theme looking at DeFi and in particular the Yearn protocol, but with a bit more focus on, I guess, some of the trends that I can see coming and just trying to put together some of the pieces on, I think the best terminology is probably longevity. Where are we going to see protocols in this very, very dynamic, and it is an ever evolving beast of a market in this DeFi space? And yet, I think overall, we're still going to see a aggregate consolidation to quality is one word, but there are a number of other moats that I think are really going to start kicking in. And there's going to be a lot of trends that revolve around those. And I think that Yearn remains one of these really, really interesting protocols because of how dynamic it is and because of the way that the development is actually progressing to actually capture a lot of these moats. So it's a really, really good case study for us to look at where we're actually seeing this market capture and where we can start seeing this particular space moving and looking for those opportunities within it. So this is a bit of a kind of a bit of a thought wave as to where I think things are going and some of the things to really look out for if you're looking to capture longevity for value. So that's certainly something that I've always focused on. Is I'm not overly fond personally of jumping between assets every 2 or 3 days, less of the trading type, certainly more of the buy and hold type scenario. And I hope that this is kind of a bit of a toolbox or a bit of an insight about what you're looking for, particularly in this DeFi space, to try and capture some of that long-term value capture. And again, Yearn is a really, really good case study, and it's not the only thing we'll talk about, but it's certainly a key part of it all. So in terms of the whole DeFi ecosystem, it is constantly evolving, and I'm already starting to see some signals that it's beginning to consolidate. And we're seeing these, what I'm calling hero protocols, these particular assets and these particular protocol networks that are starting to be core pieces. You know, they say money Lego. They're these core building blocks on which many things above are being built. So some examples of this. So Yearn is kind of the top. I'm seeing it now as the top of the stack. It's really the end goal, and it utilizes. It's actually a hero protocol that also itself utilizes a number of hero protocols. There's things like synthetics, which then brings in the scope of synthetic assets and being able to create an almost infinite mix of different protocols. And the notion of this is because it's just using a price oracle and it's a synthetic, it can basically create a non-slippage type environment. Aave is now number one in terms of lending, so there's a large pool of assets and things that you can get access to, and a lot of protocols are now building on the top of these they prefix it with like AETH and ADAI and things like that. So it's starting to become a backbone of the lending markets. Increasingly, Nexus Mutual, which is an insurance protocol, is becoming, I mean, realistically, options and insurance are going to be a very, very large part of this, particularly during this early price discovery, technology discovery phase. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. And, having some kind of options and insurance market to actually take some of that volatility and risk out of things is, in fact, a very, very strong and very, very powerful, let's call it a DeFi primitive. Nexus is actually one of these projects that I've not yet done the deep dive, but I do plan to, because I think it's one of these really important parts of the ecosystem. And Yearn is now building their own insurance protocol, which I believe leverages Nexus as well. And a few of us in the chat have been talking about it. It's got a fairly interesting token dynamic and something where you can actually look at what the price is, and you get a fairly strong metric depending on how much is locked in the protocol as to whether it's over or undervalued. So it's somewhat deterministic in that front, which is quite useful for spotting over and under opportunities. And interestingly, two of what we would have, if you wind this clock back even a month or 2 months, I would say 2 months is a reasonable time frame. If you were to wind back 2 months and look at the DeFi ecosystem, I think many would have said that Maker and Compound are the mainstays. And very, very quickly, especially after Yearn has launched, both of those protocols I'm now putting a question mark over in terms of their long-term longevity. I think that they're highly capable of being disrupted. And I saw a great tweet by Hasu today who mentioned that back in 2017, Maker was actually contemplating doing a liquidity mining phase, which would have distributed MKR to a much wider set of people. And interestingly, they opted to go down the VC pre-sale type route. And if they had done a liquidity mining phase, I would actually think that just widely distributed governance would have actually made Maker a far more robust and sound protocol. And we're seeing that Compound was obviously the one that came out with this. But they, at the end of the day, in terms of numbers already, they have now been outcompeted by Aave by some margin. I think Compound's got 1.4 billion and Aave's 1.9 something billion. So it's Aave has very quickly outstripped Compound, and they don't have a liquidity mining phase as far as I'm aware. And they're also one of these protocols that's been around for a long time. So Aave and Synthetics have both had a fairly wide distribution because they ICO'd back in 2017, I think, or 2018, and they basically traded down to nothing and have then basically been accumulated by a wide spread of people. And the other thing that's interesting is that hype really fades very quickly. We've seen all of these veggie tokens show up, and very few of them are going to have any staying power. And I was having a conversation on Twitter the other day, and my point was, if you're trying to find quality and things that are going to last in this market, just ask yourself, if the liquidity mining or the farming incentive, the token that's being issued, disappeared tomorrow, would you still use the protocol? And almost invariably, I think most people are going to say no. And really, that should be your litmus test. Would you actually personally use this protocol? If not, get rid of it. All of the ones above there, Yearn, Synthetics, Aave. I haven't used Aave, but I would use Aave because I've used Compound. Nexus makes sense. Synthetics I have used. Wi-Fi I have used. Maker I've used. I've used all those protocols, and I would use them all again. Veggie tokens, haven't used them, no interest in using them, wouldn't use them, right? So that's a really nice litmus test to try and work out what things you think are actually going to stick around. Would you actually use them if the incentive was missing? And I think that's probably your best test. And the other thing that we're seeing is ruthless competition. And this is very interesting because we're seeing basically the altcoin cycle that we saw, some of us would have seen, many haven't. This altcoin cycle that's played out many times where you get these competitors that show up and just blow their competition out of the water, and then the next one cycles in and you get this cyclical process and a lot of churn in the altcoin market. So this comes from a few layers. One is that there's cloning of code, right? Before Bitcoin there was nothing. After Bitcoin there was Litecoin and Namecoin and Peercoin, and none of them would have existed without Bitcoin. And then we've seen, we're seeing these protocols like Uniswap. Suddenly we've got SushiSwap, Kimchi, there's all these other, yield farming protocols that are trying to steal automated market making liquidity. We saw Yearn, and within a matter of days there was multiple different Yearns of all different flavors. Curve Finance is now Swerve. There's a whole bunch of these things that basically fork the code, but does that necessarily mean that they're going to stick around? And there is ruthless cloning of code. There is this persistent incentive and farming yield structures, and really these are basically like little giveaways, right? It's like if you want to ride with Uber, we're going to give you shares of Uber, right? That's essentially what these protocols are trying to do. And because they can basically spin up these at no cost, right? The ICO, you print the tokens, you give them away. It doesn't cost you anything to take that liquidity or use case away from your competitors. So you need to have something very special in order, like Uniswap, right? Uniswap has to compete with all of these other protocols that are trying to eat its lunch. And the other layer is that loyalty will follow as a religion, right? We're seeing these Bitcoin itself is a religion, Ether is a religion, Wi-Fi is rapidly becoming a religion. We're seeing these people who are ideologically attached to these protocols. Now, that makes sense in the early days, right? You get very, very strong protocols, strong communities. The question is, can they hang on to that? So initially you build that via either price, right? People love when numbers go up. And the other one is extremely high APYs, right? Which goes back to that second point. You keep creating new liquidity rewards. Oh, he's doing 10,000% APY. Why don't we do 100,000, right? So these APY mechanisms or price, and/or will build the initial community. But the question is, and this is why I keep coming back to Yearn, Yearn consistently offers in its product line, that's vaults, very high but sustained APYs, right? people are actually going to use it because it can provide them a service. And that's important. That's really what this is all about. So, loyalty will follow in a religious sense, but I actually think that having a good product that does what it actually is designed to do is a far stronger moat. And then the top section we've got here, very interestingly, Ethereum is obviously the center of gravity for this DeFi movement, but very, very quickly, layer ones and relatively new layer ones are trying to jump on board. Tron is doing what it always does, right? Copy paste and label everything after a relative of Justin Sun. It's going to do its own thing. And I saw actually some of the traders in some of the rooms that I'm in mention that Tether on Tron is currently moving about 1/10 of Ethereum, right? Of the transaction volume, and increasing. So we're seeing more and more volume of stablecoin transfers who don't want to pay the fees shifting over to Tron. FTX exchange is led by Sam Bankman-Fried. They've now pioneered Solana, right? I have not looked into Solana. It's some kind of FTX darling coin, which is supposed to be competitive with Ethereum, and they've got this Serum protocol that's some kind of DEX built on top of it. But they're essentially trying to eat Ethereum's lunch. And SushiSwap is supposed to be one of these protocols that jumps across to it. And interestingly, Binance has just launched Binance Smart Chain, which is almost to the T an exact replica of Ethereum. But my understanding is that you can essentially port Ethereum assets and transactions and wallets across to Binance Smart Chain. So again, this is another area that needs full explanation. This has only come across my feed in the last couple of days. I've got a few slides on it later on that we can look at, but this is just another example that there is ruthless competition from all mix of, you can actually see on these right-hand side. I mean, Justin Sun, FTX, and Binance, they're all centralized equivalents building Ethereum competitors. Now, I'm not saying that any of these are going to overtake Ethereum. I think that Ethereum is an interesting and unique player in this market, right? It is that decentralized side of things. But there is a potential for some of these things, like Tether and other things, to move over to these other protocols. So it is a ruthless area of competition, and building a moat is very difficult. And ultimately, you can't copy community, but you can most definitely copy code, and you can build things to try and suck competitors, your users out of your competitors' protocols. So let's just look at Yearn as an example of this. So Yearn is what I'm calling a premier eat your lunch protocol. So it initially built vaults, which is essentially a much better set token, right? It achieves far greater APYs. Its strategies are more dynamic, and it to be honest, it outcompetes set token because the gas, in order to actually deposit is already less, and you're getting better APY. So it's a better product than what set token is offering. The earn protocols are essentially better than Compound or even Aave. Because it essentially will move between whatever is the highest yielding deposited system. So if you're getting a better interest rate at Aave or Compound or Balancer or whatever it is, or Curve, it will move between those. The insurance product is essentially a Nexus interface. So yes, you could use Nexus, but you could also just go via Yearn. And this is starting to build a bit of a one-stop shop, right? So yes, it's not necessarily taking Nexus's lunch, it's utilizing Nexus, but it is aiding all of the other elements, right? All of these other products. It's essentially going to a one-stop shop, which is again very powerful. Right? And really, this is what Binance's model is build a one-stop shop that covers all user demand areas. And the most recent announcement is something called Stable Credit, which is essentially a better version of DAI and competes directly with synthetics. So you can see here that we're talking about Set Protocol, Compound, Aave, Nexus, Maker. I mean, Yearn is here to seriously eat some lunch, right? It's a hungry protocol, and it is taking over large portions of market share simply by being better and simply by being more versatile. And it does some of this by plugging into these other protocols. So it's actually a positive sum game, right? Yearn creates more users because more people want to get involved, and it benefits the underlying protocols. So it's not necessarily saying that Yearn is the be all end all. It is still reliant on these other protocols, but it is most definitely going to outcompete anything that is not serving its purpose. And when you've got a very large customer, right, which the Yearn protocol essentially is, you need to be able to actually satisfy that customer. Otherwise, you're going to disappear. And in the instance of Maker, the whole dive vault thing was creating a bit of friction, which has prompted the stable credit creation. So it's interesting. We'll touch on that shortly. And just to give you a bit of this is a snapshot from CoinGecko DeFi page. YFI at the moment, right, after having gone on a run up to $40,000 per token, which is pretty impressive, we're at $1.2 billion. Now, let's just look at synthetics, right? So synthetics is, the ones in green here are protocols that it is kind of coming after with this stable credit product. So synthetics is a $720 million market, and Maker is a $460 million market. So if we were to add both of those market caps onto Yearn, that's basically a boost of 60% and then 38%, right? So that's pretty much a 100% move. So that would put Yearn up at a $2.4 billion market cap. It's now going to potentially outcompete Compound, right? So that could be another 600 million. It could outcompete Aave, another 904. Like, you can see here that by being the top of the food chain and being as reflexive as what Yearn actually is, it's able to consume these other projects and basically capture their market cap. And because of that, you get this size creates size, right? Scalability and more users creates more liquidity. And this thing can actually start to become a very serious player in the market. It's plugging into the back end of Nexus Mutual. So there's a $460 million project with some volume that's now going to benefit both protocols. Once you start building up these, I think stable credit also includes like a Uniswap automated market maker. And you can essentially then void out 0x and KNC. So those two market caps can now be attracted by some other protocol that's capturing this value. So what I'm starting to see is we mentioned in previous newsletters, these single use or single purpose DeFi tokens. I do believe they're going to be significantly outcompete by these aggregators, these large moat building projects that can essentially capitalize on multiple layers. So you can see that a lot of this value is actually going to start flowing uphill towards the protocol that everybody is using. And Yearn is really, really well positioned to take advantage of this. So that, this is just something to kind of keep in mind, how much value actually flows, and whether these other protocols, the Aaves and the synthetics, are nimble enough to kind of maintain their specific use case. It is very possible. But there's certainly going to be some of these protocols that do get consumed. And I look at something like Compound, and I can't see how it's not going to get consumed by a combination of Aave and Yearn. I think it's going to have a very hard time maintaining its position, as well as Maker, right? Especially if this stable credit thing comes to pass. And that was kind of talking about market caps. But if we also look at things like the amount of value that we've actually got locked, you can see here that Aave has already overtaken Maker, and Compound is now down at number 6. There was a point when Compound launched its liquidity mining, and it jumped up to number 1. There it is down at number 6, and Yearn has already overtaken it, right? And very, very close. I mean, you look at the value locked for synthetics and for Yearn, another $200,000, and Yearn overtakes synthetics, right? So it is climbing the ranks very quickly. Curve Finance benefits from Yearn, so there's this symbiotic relationship between Yearn and Curve. Maker as well, since the YETH vaults went live, there's a symbiosis there. However, the stable credit system that we'll touch on in a second is essentially Yearn's answer to that. It's not governed by Yearn, so it's not a direct money market that will benefit Yearn. It's not a fee-generating thing for YFI. However, it is built by Andre, who's the guy who constructed Yearn in the first place. And the reason he's building it is because there's too much friction with Maker. So he's actually building a product to scratch his own itch, which will then make Yearn more competitive, which again will create this vicious cycle of out-competing other protocols. So Maker still necessarily loses in this type of scenario, right? So it's a very, very interesting market that's being playing out. But you can see here that it is extremely ruthless, and protocols will not last if they cannot build a sustainable and product market fit moat around themselves. So let's quickly touch on the Yearn stable credit. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that I do not fully understand this, and it was only announced the other day. I think very few people fully understand it, but my understanding is it's coming out very soon. And let me give you my kind of mental model. And there is a Bankless podcast that just came out that David Hoffman interviews Andre to kind of talk it through. There's still a lot of details that's quite intense to understand, but my general gist about what's going on is you deposit some kind of collateral. Now, the collateral that's allowed is supposed to have, it must have a Chainlink oracle, right? So Chainlink has got its dirty fingers in all of this kind of stuff. How sustainable it is a different question. Let's not go into that. For the price oracle side, it starts with anything that's got a Chainlink price, because you need some kind of oracle to give it a price when you deposit it. And the intention is to transition from a Chainlink oracle to a Uniswap oracle. So basically an oracle that is set by actual pricing in the market. Now, what that does when you deposit the collateral and it's given a price, it mints what I've just called stable credit USD, this stable credit token. Now, that stable credit token, so you deposit collateral, it mints stable credit token equal to that in a 50-50 ratio. So whatever, if you deposit $100 worth of, let's say, Aave token, it will mint $100 worth of stable credit. It then deposits those two into a Uniswap-esque automated market maker. So you've now got this liquidity pair between the newly minted token and the collateral that you deposited. Now you can then mint up to 75% of that stable credit USD. So you can now take out, you've basically got the LP token, the liquidity pool token. You can now borrow up to 75% of that value. Now, my understanding is, depending on the global pool, it's basically a huge, a very, very large multi-collateral maker CDP. And everyone's depositing all the different collateral bits in there. And if there's an excess of one particular asset, let's just say, Tether or there's too much basic attention token, you won't be able to borrow very much against that. So the idea is it's trying to incentivize a very balanced and liquid pool of everything. And there's not it becomes more capital intensive the less desirable your collateral actually is in the pool. So again, there's a lot of complexity in all of this, but the general gist is it's kind of a combination between Uniswap, a maker CDP, and it doesn't have to necessarily be just stable credit USD. It could be stable credit euro, stable credit gold, stable credit whatever. So it actually is also a combination of Uniswap, maker, and synthetics, which is what I was saying before. There is a possibility that, up here with little Yearn taking over SUSD and DAI. So you can see that it can actually start eating many of the moats that exist in some of these other protocols, which is pretty remarkable, right? You've got to give it credit where it is. We have to wait and see how this looks when it all rolls out. But in essence, Yearn doesn't control stable credit, but it is its biggest customer. And by having this stable credit system, it actually allows Yearn to scale to be much larger than it currently is. At the moment, they've had to cap some of their vaults, in particular the YETH vault, because it was just limited by the scale of Maker, right? And it's a protocol that's now reliant on Maker doing its own, DAI caps and all that kind of stuff. And essentially, this just removes all of that friction. And you now get Yearn that can now expand itself. So it doesn't generate fees for YFI, but it allows YFI to expand much bigger than it currently is, which again is going to benefit YFI. So, there's a huge moat that's being slowly built here, which is very, very impressive. It is a remarkable project, to be honest. And just let's take the whole other side of things, right? So Yearn is trying to go the full decentralized plus governance type approach. And one other thing to note, by the way, is there's a current vote going on to permanently change the smart contract to prevent any more Wi-Fi being minted. So at the moment, there's 30,000 Yearn. It is possible for governance to vote to mint more. There's a proposal at the moment which has a overwhelming vote to approve that's essentially going to cap it and say permanently lock it down so it will never be more than 30,000. So again, this is bullish on the scarcity front, and I think it's going to pass without too much of a hiccup. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But CZ, our good friend CZ, has come out with the term CDeFi, right? Question mark what? CDeFi is a very interesting, does what it says on the tin product. It has a product market fit. Binance has always had a product market fit, and you've got to give CZ credit where it's due. He does this very, very well. So, let's just go left to right here. He's saying one coin, two interoperable chains. One coin, multiple staking, yield farming powers. The notion here is that you could use BNB to actually yield farm, and CZ is Yearn, right? CZ does the centralized version of what Yearn does about chasing yield in various areas, right? He'll have a trading desk, and their job is to move customer funds to take advantage of DeFi, right? They're building up all of these different functions that allow BNB to be that particular asset, right? The equivalent of ETH, depositing it in. And now I don't know whether you have to deposit via Binance, or you can see in the middle here, they're about to launch Binance Smart Chain, which I need to do a whole deep dive on to understand what is going on here. But you can see there that they've taken the Etherscan logo and converted it to yellow and said good to go. And I had a very brief look at this. They've literally copy pasted everything to do with Ethereum, and I think that they're directly portable. So, he said here, Binance Smart Chain never aimed to replace ETH. Binance Smart Chain is just ETH compatible. Smart projects giving users more options for cheaper fees. The idea here is that I believe you can port assets that you have on Ethereum over to Binance Smart Chain. And I don't know whether this is just CZ, performing these actions on Ethereum, I don't know how this works. I don't know whether there's some kind of sidechain peg. He claims somewhere that it's actually not built by Binance. They're only part of it. To be honest, I really don't know. But CZ and the centralized side of things is competition, right? And you can see on the right-hand side here, we've got CoinMarketCap, right, which he now owns, or Binance now owns. They're taking on the DeFi thing, right? They're building new dashboards. They're getting on board with the whole thing. And they're making sure that Binance does not lose relevance, even in a realm of DeFi. And centralized competition is always going to be more efficient. It just is, because centralization, you basically trade off the security assurance of decentralization for trust. So instead of relying on human incentives and complex distributed computer systems, you basically include trust, and you nullify a large portion of the inefficiencies, right? If you have one block validator, aka an exchange, if you trust that exchange, then you can get very, very high TPS. If you don't trust people, that's when you need to start including miners and proof of work and validators and all this kind of stuff. Centralized exchanges can generate alternate revenue streams, whether it be trading fees or staking fees or all sorts of other stuff, right? They want you on their platform, same as Yearn. They want more people to be using it because that generates income across the board, and it means that they can provide more convenient systems, and they can usually provide far greater APY returns, right? Staking returns. We saw this with Tezos. Most centralized exchanges give far, far better APY rates for staking these coins because they can earn their revenue from other sources, right? And it does provide that convenience for the user, and especially in a realm where gas fees are going to be very, very high, these centralized systems actually work very well. And most people do lose money in this yield farming thing because we know that markets are savage and brutal and take people's money. This is why Yearn is powerful, and this is why Binance is powerful, because essentially they're two different approaches to doing the same task. Which is providing users with a service that is a one-stop shop. And, really this is what it's all about. And we're going to see these aggregators, both on the centralized and the decentralized front, really, really starting to compete for block space. And, we saw here, this is the announcement, right? So it is really hard to bet against CZ, and he likes creating green vertical candles, right? So, BNB is a genuine play, even if you just want to ride the actual hype of this thing. And it is worth looking at this Binance Smart Chain because, even if it's just a trading opportunity, say what you will against Binance, there's no question that they're here to stay, and they know how to, make price appreciate. So from a trader's opportunity, this is most definitely something to be paying attention to because, it's essentially achieving the same as what Yearn is, but with a centralized service with all the capital and brains behind it that CZ can muster. So ultimately what this comes down to is trying to identify product market fits. And for longevity, we need to identify these product market fits which create moats. So interestingly, price oracles is one of these continuous things that comes up. DeFi is so heavily reliant on price oracles. This is not only a moat, but it is also a single point of failure. And this is why I remain skeptical of Chainlink, because I don't believe they've actually solved the problem. There's lots of layers to that, and there's lots of views on that. But most definitely, price oracles as a tool is absolutely necessary in DeFi. and it is also a single point of failure. So it's both an opportunity and a risk to be aware of, and scale, right, gets scale. Chainlink does have a stranglehold. Whether they're doing what they say they're doing or not is kind of irrelevant, to be honest. We know that this market tends to disregard fundamentals to a great extent. They are the centerpiece of a very, very large portion of this ecosystem, and that is rapidly becoming a moat, right? So, and it can very well be the case that they don't have a product that works, and simply by having the volume and the price appreciation and the ability to create money, right, just basically pump this thing up, cash out, and then use those funds to build the product, they can actually get there in the end, right? There's volume and deep liquidity. So it's going to be very interesting to see once the rewards run out from all these Uniswap competitors, and also Uniswap version 3 is coming, which will have a token. So we will see how that all pans out. But volume and deep liquidity is a moat. We see this across both layer ones, but also in these decentralized exchanges. Without good liquidity, people are just going to move to the next one, and they need to be cheap as well. So this is why Uniswap gets plugged into a lot of these things, because it's very, very simple code. It's a few hundred lines of code for the whole thing, and it therefore can be very gas efficient. Things like aggregators and efficiency. So this is what Yearn and Binance are really doing. They're making it very efficient for people. They're reducing many, many gas transactions to a single deposit, right? And then the system basically does the rest for you. And this creates a very, very convenient system. So, ultimately, these are the things that are going to create a long-lasting and sustainable project in this space. There really aren't that many who can actually say that they tick many of these boxes. And interestingly, the ones that you can see here with the logos up are kind of the protocols and businesses that are in fact hitting almost all of these things, right? Price oracles aside, they are actually hitting all of these different elements. They have the liquidity, they are aggregators, they provide customers with a useful service, and ultimately you can clone the code, but you cannot clone cumulative product market fit. It's one thing to have product market fit, it's another thing to be in a competition, but to build up a following, whether it's of users, developers, liquidity providers, the whole lot, to be able to build that up and maintain it over time, that is that cumulative product market fit, and it makes these moats very, very hard to overcome. So there is going to be a lot of competition. There's going to be a lot of new protocols springing up because you can copy code. But the reality is that there is going to be a consolidation over time, and we're already seeing that starting to play out. And I think at this point in time, I still think even at $40,000, right? There's obviously going to be technical analysis and stuff to get the best edge in the entry, but I still think my gut is telling me that Wi-Fi remains undervalued, especially in the long term, right? Assuming that we don't get any kind of global collapse of DeFi and all the rest of it, my assumption is that it is probably going to go much higher than this. I think that it remains undervalued, and that's simply on the basis of how much other product it's able to eat and pull under the Yearn brand. And I think that's it's quite impressive. I think Uniswap, that when the Uniswap token shows up, I think it is going to be fairly substantial. I think there is a trading opportunity to price appreciation here. I don't know about the liquidity farming side of things. I would suggest that there'll be a vault that shows up from Yearn that actually allows you to farm Uni tokens. So I would be on the lookout for something like that. And for Binance, I need to look into Binance Smart Chain. I think there is an opportunity here that CZ is going to return with a vengeance. And I think he's got the tools and the know-how to do it. So I need to look into it more. I need to understand how the system works. But I think there is an opportunity to do that research and understand it. So these are kind of the 3 or 4 protocols that I think are really capturing a large portion of these, and it's worth keeping an eye on. So hopefully that was a bit of an overview on what the kind of moats I'm seeing start to form are, and where I think value is starting to flow. And I think it's actually going to start, a lot of these protocols are going to start cannibalizing their friends, because if you're not serving a purpose and I could do it better than you, then I'm going to do it and basically consume your market share. And I think the market will reprice these things fairly quickly. So at the end of the day, always question, if the incentives dried up and the yield farming dried up, would I use this product? And ultimately, I've used all 4 of these products and continue to use these products. And to me, it makes a lot of sense to bet on those particular moves and ignore the kimchis and the Solanas and all these other things until you find an actual use that you find useful. Then generally that's a good signal that the market probably won't see that either. So this is probably a view for people who are longer term thinkers, people who are looking to just buy and hold long term assets. This is kind of my framework that I use to break these things down. So hopefully that was useful. And as always, you can always grab me in the chat room to talk these things over. Have a good week. Cheers.